mean, technically it's a bad thing. This is Episodes Explained, Jumping the Shark. So in the comments below, let me know, what are the big jumping the shark moments in TV that you think of when you think of jumping the shark? So yeah, it actually literally does refer to the Fonz and Happy Days jumping the shark, but the idea of it actually came about a decade later. I think Happy Days was actually off the air at this point, but a college guy made an argument that jumping the shark was a sign of a show's decline or decline in popularity, or they've run out of ideas. You know, all the negative things we think of when we think of jumping the shark. But ironically, Happy Days, it doesn't seem to have affected them in any way other than Henry Winkler's constantly getting asked about it now. So a lot of jumping the shark is the idea of the show overstaying its welcome, maybe leaning on gimmicks or stunts or stunt casting, you know, deviations from what the show is and what made the show great. A lot of times they're thought of as like futile attempts to reinvigorate or make a show better after it's past its prime. What I really think of as jumping the shark is when something happens in the show where it strays too far away from its sensibilities, or at least what made the show great, or at least what made the fans like the show the way it did. And so it's a deviation from what the fans expected or got used to about the show. So there's usually some change that happens in the show, usually later on in seasons, later on in the life of the show, where there's been a production change or a cast change or a writing change, or usually all three. A lot of times a major cast member leaves and then there's a void, because once you get sort of the sweet spot of the cast interacting the way it is, the writers figuring out how to write to these actors, that kind of thing, do you just ignore the fact that that cast member left, or do you try to replace them, or do you promote some B-level cast member up? There's all these questions, and how's that going to mess with the chemistry of the show and the writing of the show? Sometimes the show will try to retool itself, rebuild itself, or even repilot. I think there's also a more subtle aspect of it, which is the writer's room of it all. So I want to sort of put my theory forward now, which is this idea of writer's room churn or writer's churn. Specifically restaurants or the service industry, there's a lot of churn, which is to say a lot of people getting hired, a lot of people quitting, and a lot more people getting hired. So there's this constant churn of people coming in and out. I do think it kind of happens in the writer's room. And so writers in a first season show are usually hired right after the pilot by the producers and the showrunner to write the show, and they're usually, you know, not very high status, but there is a hierarchy in the writer's room. There always has been. But by the end of the first season, everybody gets a promotion if the show gets a new season usually, and so everybody gets bumped up, and maybe a few extra writers get hired, maybe a couple leave to go on and make their own shows if they're senior enough or if they sold shows. And as the show gets older, as more seasons happen, you get to, I feel like you notice in seasons like 4 through 6 or 4 through 7, there's a different quality by these later seasons, because the original writers that were in season 1 may not be on the show anymore because they've been promoted in the hierarchy so high that they're usually off working on their own shows, or they're on other shows as executive producers or, you know, high-level writers. So you have a bunch of new writers that weren't there for the original season now writing the show, and so they haven't had all that, I guess, seat time to sort of work the show the way the original writers worked the show, for good or bad. Some cousins to jumping the shark, I think my generation, obviously it's nuking the fridge, which is a reference to the last Indiana Jones movie where he climbs into a fridge and somehow survives a nuclear blast. And I would say jumping the shark is usually a bad thing. Nuking the fridge is a much more pejorative, much more, you know, contemptuous thing. As a writer, I'm probably not even comfortable referring to a show as nuking the fridge, because I work in this industry and people talk, and I don't want to be accused of, you know, having that much contempt for a show. Let's be honest. There's also the opposite of jumping the shark, which Star Trek fans will know as growing the beard, which is a Star Trek The Next Generation reference. In the first season of The Next Generation, it was kind of a messy season, not great, but then they go into season 2 and beyond. The show, the quality took a huge upswing, especially in season 3 and beyond, and the big thing that everybody noticed going into season 2 is clean-shaven Riker now has the beard, and that's the Riker we all love. That's the Riker that Trekkies, you know, respond to. There's also this idea of immediately jumping the shark, which I don't really buy into, but I hear cartoons, especially like Rick and Morty, being accused of immediately jumping the shark. I just don't think that's how that works, because you have to have established some kind of way of working. You have to have established some sort of norm in the show. You can't immediately jump the shark because you have to have something established in order to deviate so far from it that it becomes a problem. And so examples, I think the obvious one, The Office, I don't really need to go into it, but I think once Michael Scott left The Office, the show became different for obvious Michael Scott reasons, but obviously it was an older show at that point. Anyway, There's also the Battlestar Galactica reboot. I point to, mid to late season 3 when they talk about the final 5 and it's the whole reveal. I think the whole nerve hit about the fans with that being a jumping the shark moment is the final 5 storyline kind of undermined so much of the Battlestar Galactica storyline up until that point. I don't have contempt for the final 5 storyline, but I do recognize it as, if I would to call anything a jumping the shark moment, it would be that. But basically any long running show is gonna have a jumping the shark because, at some point the show gets old, runs out of ideas, is afraid of repeating itself, maybe is trying to branch off or explore new territories. I point to Supernatural as an example of a show that, depending on where you look, like what season, it's a different show. It evolves as it goes on. So yeah, jumping the shark, usually used as a negative way of saying the show has gotten too old, it's lost what made it good, that kind of thing. But there are exceptions. I think the exception that proves the rule is actually Happy Days, where Fonzie literally jumps over the shark, because best I can figure, it didn't negatively affect the show in any way. The show went on to be a #1 show for multiple seasons after that. So I point to the jump the shark moment, especially when it comes to TV, as the moment where the show changes so much that it's obviously different from what it used to be. Maybe not a bad thing, maybe not a good thing. And then let's get back to Supernatural. Again, I was the Supernatural guy who was the original fan base in seasons 1 and 2 when it was a horror movie, and then I sort of fell off when it became a different kind of show, and then obviously it evolved again. But I think that's a good way to describe jumping the shark, is actually the fan base. I think jumping the shark really happens when the first group of fans is replaced by a different group of fans, a second group of fans. And that's why you can see there's a little bit of contemptuousness there, because the first group of fans is going to consider it a bad thing. The second group of fans considers it a good thing. And in the case of Supernatural, for instance, the first group of fans is not nearly the size or boisterousness of the second group of fans. So honestly, the show probably benefited from the different, much bigger crowd. It's not necessarily a TV episode, but I do think it's a thing that happens in TV, and I think most of the time you can point to a specific episode in TV when this happens. So that's jumping the shark. Did I get close to the definition that you use? Let me know what you think. Like, share, subscribe. I'll catch you next time.